638. That is the number of times, according to Cuban intelligence, that the Central Intelligence Agency attempted to assassinate Fidel Castro between 1959 and 2000. The number is disputed. American officials have never confirmed it. But the documented attempts alone, the ones that appear in declassified CIA files, congressional testimony, and the memoirs of the operatives involved, are sufficient to tell a story that is simultaneously one of the most consequential and one of the most consistently incompetent covert operations in the history of American intelligence. The methods included exploding cigars, a poisoned wetsuit, a booby-trapped seashell, bacterial agents slipped into his food, a fountain pen converted into a hypodermic syringe, and a plan to make his beard fall out to undermine his public image. The CIA hired the American Mafia. It recruited Castro's own lovers. It worked with Cuban exile groups whose internal security was so compromised that Havana almost certainly knew about the plots before they were executed. None of it worked. Castro outlived 10 American presidents, 9 CIA directors, and the entire Cold War. He died in his bed in 2016 at the age of 90, having spent more than half a century as the target of the most sustained assassination campaign in the history of American covert action. The question of why every attempt failed is not simply a question about operational competence, though competence is certainly part of the answer. It is a question about what happens when an institution becomes so committed to a particular outcome that it loses the capacity to evaluate whether that outcome is achievable and continues pursuing it long after any rational assessment would have concluded that the effort was counterproductive. To understand the Castro assassination program, you need to understand how it started, what it became, and what it tells us about the limits of what covert action can actually accomplish. Welcome back to Cold War Vault. Every week we open a new file. The secrets just got buried, we dig them up. Fidel Castro came to power on January 1st, 1959, when his July 26th movement forces entered Havana as the Batista regime collapsed. The American response to his revolution was initially cautious rather than hostile. Eisenhower's administration was not immediately certain that Castro was a communist, and early diplomatic contacts suggested that a working relationship might be possible. That assessment changed rapidly. Castro's nationalization of American-owned businesses and properties, his increasingly warm relationship with the Soviet Union, and his rhetorical attacks on American imperialism convinced Eisenhower's administration by 1960 that Castro represented a strategic threat that could not be managed through conventional diplomacy. Cuba was 90 miles from Florida. The possibility of a Soviet-aligned communist state permanently established in the Caribbean was, from Washington's perspective, strategically intolerable. The CIA's initial approach to the Cuba problem was not assassination, but regime change through covert means, specifically the training and support of Cuban exile forces who would invade the island, trigger a popular uprising against Castro, and replace his government with one more amenable to American interests. That plan, inherited by the Kennedy administration from Eisenhower, became the Bay of Pigs operation of April 1961. The Bay of Pigs was a catastrophe of the first order. 1,400 Cuban exiles landed at the Bay of Pigs on Cuba's southern coast on April 17, 1961. Within 72 hours they had been defeated, with more than 100 dead and over 1,000 captured. The expected popular uprising did not materialize. American air support, which Kennedy had reduced from the original plan for fear of making American involvement too obvious, was insufficient to compensate for the operational failures on the ground. The defeat did not weaken Castro, it strengthened him. He emerged from the Bay of Pigs, with his domestic position more secure than before, his revolutionary credentials validated by having defeated an American-backed invasion, and his relationship with Moscow deepened by the demonstration that he needed Soviet support to survive American hostility. For the Kennedy administration, the Bay of Pigs failure was humiliating and politically damaging. It also produced a dangerous institutional dynamic. The CIA and the administration became more committed to Castro's removal, not less, precisely because the first attempt had failed so visibly. The emotional and institutional investment in defeating Castro increased with each setback, creating a feedback loop in which failure generated escalation rather than reassessment. It was in this environment that the assassination program, which had been running in parallel with the Bay of Pigs planning, became a central element of American Cuba policy. The CIA's decision to recruit the American Mafia as partners in the Castro assassination program is one of the most extraordinary and revealing episodes in the history of American covert action, not because it was operationally unusual by the standards of Cold War intelligence, but because of what it reveals about the institutional culture that produced it. The logic was straightforward, at least on paper. The Mafia had substantial interests in Cuba that Castro's revolution had destroyed. Havana had been one of the most profitable gambling and entertainment markets in the Western Hemisphere, controlled by organized crime families with close relationships to the Batista regime. The revolution had nationalized the casinos, expelled the American mob, and eliminated hundreds of millions of dollars in annual revenue. The Mafia had both the motive and the operational capability to reach Castro in ways that the CIA, operating under significant constraints in post-revolution Cuba, did not. The CIA officer responsible for making the Mafia connection was Sheffield Edwards, the agency's director of security. Through a private detective named Robert Maheu, who served as an intermediary, Edwards made contact with two senior organized crime figures, Johnny Roselli, a Las Vegas-based mob figure with connections across multiple crime families, and Sam Giancana, the boss of the Chicago outfit, one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the United States. The meetings between CIA representatives and the Mafia figures took place in Miami and Las Vegas hotels in late 1960. The CIA provided poison pills, designed by its Technical Services Division, that were intended to be slipped into Castro's food or drink. The Mafia would provide the access and the personnel to deliver them. The operation failed repeatedly for reasons that were partly operational and partly structural. The Mafia's networks in Cuba, while real, were not as penetrating as the CIA had hoped. The poison pills were passed to Cuban intermediaries, who reported on multiple occasions that they had been unable to find a suitable opportunity to administer them. One account describes the pills dissolving before they could be used. Another describes a would-be assassin losing his nerve at the critical moment. What is equally striking is the governance situation that the Mafia partnership created. The CIA was now running a joint operation with organized crime figures who were simultaneously under active investigation by the FBI. Robert Kennedy, as Attorney General, was conducting an aggressive campaign against organized crime, with Giancana among the primary targets. The CIA was working with a man that the Attorney General was trying to prosecute on an operation that the Attorney General had not been fully briefed on. When the FBI placed Giancana under surveillance and discovered his meetings with CIA representatives, the resulting conflict between the two agencies was managed through a series of quiet agreements that essentially required the FBI to stand down on certain aspects of its Giancana investigation in exchange for CIA cooperation on other matters. The institutional corruption that flowed from the Mafia partnership extended beyond the operational. It created relationships and obligations that persisted long after the specific assassination plots had been abandoned, and it established a precedent for the use of criminal partners in covert operations that had consequences extending well beyond the Cuba program. The Bay of Pigs failure led directly to the creation of Operation Mongoose, the Kennedy administration's comprehensive program for destabilizing Cuba and removing Castro. Mongoose was placed under the direction of Brigadier General Edward Lansdale, a legendary figure in counterinsurgency who had run successful programs in the Philippines and Vietnam, and it represented the most sustained and resourced covert program the United States had ever directed against a single foreign leader. Mongoose encompassed economic sabotage, propaganda, support for internal resistance groups, and continued assassination planning. At its peak, it involved hundreds of CIA personnel and thousands of Cuban exile operatives, with a budget running into tens of millions of dollars annually. It had its own command structure, its own logistics, and its own intelligence collection apparatus focused entirely on Cuba. The assassination component of Mongoose produced some of the most operationally bizarre schemes in CIA history, schemes that have since become so well known that they risk being dismissed as comic rather than understood as genuinely sinister in their intent. The exploding cigar scheme was real, though it never progressed beyond the planning stage. Castro was known for his cigars, and the CIA's Technical Services Division explored whether an exploding cigar could be delivered to him. The technical challenges proved insurmountable, or at least sufficient to prevent the scheme from being operationally deployed. The poisoned wetsuit scheme was more advanced. Castro was known to enjoy scuba diving, and a CIA technical officer named James Donovan, who was simultaneously negotiating the release of Bay of Pigs prisoners with Cuban officials, was asked to present Castro with a gift of a wetsuit that had been treated with a fungal skin disease and lined with a tubercle bacillus in the breathing apparatus. Donovan, apparently unaware of what his colleagues had done, gave Castro a different wetsuit entirely, unwittingly foiling the plot. The plan to make Castro's beard fall out deserves particular attention, because it reveals something important about the analytical failures of the program. Castro's beard was considered a central element of his revolutionary image, and CIA planners believed that if it could be made to fall out, his authority and charisma would be undermined. Thallium salts, which cause hair loss, were identified as the agent of choice, and a plan was developed to dust his shoes with the compound when they were left outside his hotel room during a foreign trip. The plan was never executed. The assumption that Castro's political authority was dependent on his facial hair rather than on his extraordinary political and personal capabilities speaks volumes about the quality of analysis that was driving the program. The most operationally serious assassination attempt of the Mongoose period involved a Cuban official named Rolando Cubela, who approached the CIA in 1961, claiming to be disillusioned with the revolution and willing to kill Castro from the inside. The CIA gave Cubela the codename Amlash and spent years cultivating him as an asset, providing him with weapons and ultimately with a pen converted into a hypodermic syringe filled with poison that could be used to inject Castro in close quarters. What the CIA did not adequately verify was whether Cubela was what he claimed to be. Cuban intelligence has subsequently claimed that Cubela was a double agent, knowingly providing information to Havana while accepting CIA support. Whether or not that claim is accurate, Cubela was arrested by Cuban security in 1966 and convicted of conspiracy, receiving a death sentence that was commuted, apparently at Castro's personal request, to 30 years imprisonment. He was released in 1979 and eventually settled in Spain. The Amlash operation was, in retrospect, a masterclass in the operational security failures that characterized the entire program. The CIA was running an asset whose reliability it had not adequately verified, in an environment where Cuban intelligence had demonstrated extraordinary capability at identifying and penetrating American operations, and it was doing so while simultaneously pursuing so many parallel tracks against Castro that coordinating operational security across all of them was essentially impossible. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 created a paradox at the heart of American Cuba policy that was never resolved, and that continued to distort the assassination program for years afterward. The crisis began when American U-2 reconnaissance flights discovered Soviet nuclear missiles being installed in Cuba, giving the Soviet Union a first strike capability against the continental United States from a range that eliminated most of the warning time American defenses depended on. Kennedy's management of the crisis, the naval blockade, the private negotiations with Khrushchev, and the eventual Soviet withdrawal of the missiles is generally considered one of the most successful pieces of crisis diplomacy in American history. What is less often discussed is the settlement's implications for American Cuba policy. Part of the private agreement that ended the crisis included an American pledge not to invade Cuba. That pledge was not made public, and it created an immediate problem for Operation Mongoose and the assassination program. The United States had secretly committed to leaving Castro in place while simultaneously running an extensive covert program designed to remove him. The assassination plots continued after the missile crisis, technically in violation of the spirit, if not the letter, of the Kennedy-Khrushchev understanding. They continued through the Johnson administration, which inherited them along with the rest of the Cuba program, and which maintained them with somewhat less intensity as Vietnam consumed increasing proportions of American strategic attention and resources. The plots also continued against a backdrop of a separate negotiating track, secret contacts between American and Cuban officials exploring the possibility of normalized relations. In November of 1963, the same day that Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, a CIA officer named Desmond Fitzgerald was meeting with Rolando Kubela in Paris, providing him with the poison pen that was intended to kill Castro. Kennedy was murdered in Dallas while the CIA was simultaneously running an assassination plot against the leader of a country whose government he was secretly considering opening negotiations with. The historical irony is almost too compressed to absorb. Some researchers have spent decades exploring whether there is any connection between the CIA Mafia Cuba assassination network and the Kennedy assassination. The Warren Commission addressed the question and found no evidence of such a connection. Subsequent investigations, including the House Select Committee on Assassinations in the late 1970s, reached more ambiguous conclusions. The question has never been definitively resolved, and the destruction of relevant CIA records means it probably never will be. The 638 attempts, or whatever the accurate number is, failed for reasons that are individually various but structurally consistent. The first reason is Castro himself. Whatever his political legacy, Fidel Castro was a man of extraordinary intelligence, physical courage and personal charisma who understood from the beginning that his survival was a political objective of the first order for his enemies. He was not paranoid in the clinical sense, but he was appropriately vigilant, varying his routines, limiting the circle of people with access to him, and maintaining a security apparatus that was genuinely capable. Cuban intelligence, the DGI, was one of the most effective intelligence services in the world during the Cold War, far more capable relative to its resources than the CIA typically acknowledged. The second reason is operational security failure. The CIA's Cuba operations were penetrated by Cuban intelligence at multiple levels and from early in the program's history. The Cuban exile community that provided most of the operational personnel was large, politically fractious, and thoroughly infiltrated. The mafia figures who served as partners had their own interests and their own indiscretions. The sheer number of people involved in the program at any given time made genuine operational security essentially impossible. The third reason is analytical failure. The CIA consistently overestimated the fragility of Castro's domestic position and underestimated the genuine support his revolution commanded among significant portions of the Cuban population. Program after program was premised on the assumption that Castro was one push away from collapse, that the right provocation would trigger the popular uprising that would sweep him from power. That assumption was wrong in 1961, and it remained wrong for decades, but the institution that had built its Cuba policy around it was not capable of revising it without revising the entire strategic framework that justified the program's existence. The fourth reason, and perhaps the most structurally significant, is the absence of a viable alternative. Castro was a problem that American policy had defined as requiring his personal removal. Once that definition was accepted, the program could not be abandoned without acknowledging that the definition had been wrong, which in turn would require acknowledging the failures of analysis and judgment that had produced it. So the program continued, year after year, becoming increasingly detached from any realistic assessment of its prospects, sustained by institutional momentum and political commitment, rather than by any rational expectation of success. The Church Committee investigations of 1975 brought the assassination plots into public view for the first time, producing congressional and public outrage that led directly to Executive Order 11905, signed by President Ford in 1976, which prohibited American government employees from engaging in or conspiring to engage in political assassination. The order remains in effect, though its interpretation and application have been contested in the decades since. The Castro assassination program was not the last time the United States government would attempt to remove a foreign leader through covert means, but it was the most sustained, the most extensively documented, and the most comprehensively failed such effort in American history. Its legacy is partly the specific damage it caused, the criminal partnerships it created, the resources it consumed, the operational failures it produced, and the diplomatic complications it generated. But its deeper legacy is the question it poses about institutional rationality. How does an institution that has committed itself to an objective continue to pursue that objective long after any rational assessment would have concluded it was unachievable? And what does that persistence tell us about how large bureaucracies actually function when they are insulated from accountability? The answer to that question is not specific to the CIA or to the Cold War. It is a question about institutions in general, and it is one that the Castro assassination program illustrates with unusual clarity and at unusual length. Fidel Castro died on November 25, 2016, at the age of 90. He died of natural causes in Havana, surrounded by family. He had outlived the CIA program designed to kill him by more than 4 decades. The men who designed that program, the CIA directors who authorized it, the presidents who knew about it, the mafia figures who were recruited for it, virtually all of them died before Castro did. The target outlived the hunters by a margin that is itself a kind of verdict on the program's effectiveness. What the 638 attempts, or whatever the true number is, actually accomplished was to validate Castro's narrative about American imperialism, strengthen his domestic political position every time a plot was exposed or failed, deepen Cuba's relationship with the Soviet Union by demonstrating the extent of American hostility, and consume enormous resources that might have been directed toward actually understanding and managing the Cuba problem rather than simply trying to make it disappear by killing one man. The lesson that American policymakers drew from the Castro program was incomplete. They concluded that assassination was too operationally difficult and too politically costly to be a reliable tool of foreign policy. What they drew less clearly was the prior lesson, that defining a complex geopolitical problem as a problem of one man's continued existence is itself a failure of analysis, and that the method's impossibility was in some ways the least important of its failures. Next week, we open a file that takes us to one of the most obscure and consequential conflicts of the entire Cold War, a war that America fought for 14 years without ever officially being there, in the mountains and jungles of a country most Americans cannot find on a map. 30,000 soldiers died. The United States dropped more bombs there than on all of World War II combined. And when it was over, the people who had trusted America with their lives were left to face the consequences alone. Subscribe to Cold War Vault. The secrets just got buried. We dig them up.